The morning Sylvie Crane's life stopped being her own started the way most disasters do, quietly, with paperwork. She stood in the doorway of the Cooperton land office, holding a letter that had traveled 3 weeks to find her in Missouri, and read it twice before the words made sense. Her father's debts, the farm she'd grown up on, seized by the Territorial Bank as of the first of the month. She'd known the numbers were bad. She hadn't known they were that bad. The land agent, a thin man named Grover who smelled of tobacco and mild contempt, watched her from behind his desk with the practiced patience of someone who'd delivered this particular kind of news many times before. "There is one option," he said, a sliding document across the desk. "Man named Calder Foss, rancher up in the Redstone Valley. He wrote to us 2 months ago, looking for a woman willing to come out and manage the household. His wife passed last winter. He's got 2 children and a cattle operation that's struggling without someone holding the domestic side together." Grover paused. "It's a work arrangement, legal and documented. He pays the passage, provides room and board, and..." Another pause. "He's agreed to settle the outstanding debt on this property in exchange for a 1-year commitment." Sylvie looked at the document, then at the letter, then at the window where Cooperton's dusty Main Street offered nothing that looked like a future. "How far is Redstone Valley?" she asked. 4 days by stage." She signed the paper before she could think too hard about it. Thinking hadn't been serving her well lately. The stage dropped her in a town called Harrow Creek on a Thursday afternoon. Nothing about Harrow Creek suggested it was a place people chose to be. One general store, a saloon that looked like it was losing a slow argument with gravity, a church with a crooked steeple. The surrounding hills were brown and dry, and the sky was the particular pale color that meant heat had been sitting on the land for weeks without relief. A wagon was waiting at the post office. The man standing beside it was not what Sylvie had pictured. She'd pictured someone older, beaten down in the way that grief and hard work and bad luck beat people down. Hunched, apologetic, easy to manage. What she got was Calder Foss, who was somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than ordinary skin and bone. Dark hair. Dark eyes that settled on her with an assessment so direct it almost felt rude. He didn't offer his hand. Just looked at her the way you'd look at a horse you'd agreed to buy sight unseen and were now reconsidering. "Miss Crane," he said. "Mr. Foss, you're smaller than I expected. You're quieter than I expected," she said, because it was true, and because she'd spent 4 days on a stagecoach with 3 other people and had already used up her patience for being polite to strangers. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a recalibration. He loaded her single trunk into the wagon without asking for help and climbed up onto the seat. She climbed up on the other side. They rode the 12 miles to the ranch without talking, which suited Sylvie fine. She used the time to watch the country she was driving into. Dry creek beds, juniper and scrub. Hills that would have been beautiful if they weren't so clearly exhausted. The ranch appeared as the sun started its drop toward the western ridge. It was bigger than she'd expected. Main house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, corrals that probably held 50 head when things were going well. Right now the corrals held maybe 30 cattle, and the visible expressions of deferred maintenance. A fence panel here, a barn door there, things that had been set aside in favor of more urgent problems and then forgotten. 2 children were sitting on the porch steps when the wagon pulled in. A girl of about 9 with her father's dark eyes and a book held open in her lap. A boy of maybe 6 who looked up from whatever he'd been drawing in the dirt and watched Sylvie with the frank curiosity of someone too young to pretend otherwise. "This is Bea," Calder said, "and that's Silas." "Hello," Sylvie said. Bea looked at her with careful politeness. Silas said, "You don't look like Mama," Silas, Calder said quietly. "I know I don't," Sylvie said. "I'm not trying to. My name's Sylvie. I'm here to help out." Silas considered this. Then he went back to his dirt drawing, apparently satisfied. Bea went back to her book, though Sylvie noticed she wasn't actually reading it anymore. The room she was given was small and clean, with a window that faced east. Someone had put a dried flower arrangement on the windowsill. Bea probably, Sylvie decided, though she didn't ask. She unpacked her trunk, hung her 2 dresses on the available hooks, and sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 2 minutes, feeling the full weight of what she'd done. Then she got up and went to find the kitchen, because feeling things was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. The first weeks passed in the way of all new arrangements, the awkward choreography of people learning each other's habits without asking directly. Calder left before dawn and returned after dark. He ate whatever Sylvie had made without complaint and without much comment. He was not unkind. He was simply absent, present in the body but removed in some essential way, going through motions that grief had worn smooth from repetition. The children were easier. Silas, she learned quickly, was gentle and imaginative and terrified of thunder. Bea was observant and cautious and had been acting as the household's emotional anchor since her mother died, which was far too much for a 9-year-old to carry, and something Sylvie said about quietly dismantling. She started giving Bea back her childhood in small increments. Let me worry about the bread. You go red. What Sylvie hadn't expected was the rest of it. 3 weeks in, a man arrived at the ranch while Calder was out on the South Range. He rode a horse that cost more than everything Calder Foss owned, and he wore the particular expression of someone who decided he was doing you a favor by showing up. His name was Porter Hatch, and he represented something called the Redstone Land and Water Consortium. He had papers. He always had papers, Mrs. He looked at her. What's your arrangement here exactly? I manage the household. He looked past her at the ranch, at the dry corrals, the tired fences. Mr. Foss is 2 years behind on his water use fees. The consortium controls the creek rights on this section. If he can't settle the account, we'll be redirecting the water allocation to the Harmon parcel come spring. He offered a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. You might want to mention that to him, for planning purposes. After he rode away, Sylvie stood in the yard for a long moment thinking about what 2 years without creek water would do to cattle in a drought year. Then she went inside and wrote down exactly what the man had said and what he'd looked like, and the name on the papers he'd shown her, because she'd learned that the details nobody thought to record were usually the ones that mattered later. She didn't tell Calder that night. She waited until Sunday morning, when the children were occupied and the kitchen was quiet and Calder was sitting with coffee he hadn't touched yet. Porter Hatch came by Tuesday, she said, and laid her notes on the table in front of him. He read them without speaking. His jaw tightened in a way that told her this wasn't new information, just the latest chapter of something that had been going on for a while. How long has the consortium been at you? She asked. He looked up. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. 2 years, he said. Since your wife died. The muscle in his jaw moved. About then. Sylvie refilled his coffee, sat down across from him. Tell me the whole of it. He didn't want to. She could see that. Men like Calder Foss came from a long line of people who believed that asking for help was a form of failure. That admitting trouble was the same as inviting more of it. But something in her directness, or maybe just the fact that she'd been the one to bring the notes to the table, shifted something. He talked. Slowly at first, then more. The consortium had been buying up water rights in Redstone Valley for 3 years. Small ranches that fell behind on fees found their water cut off. With no water, cattle died. With dead cattle, there was no income. With no income, loans went unpaid. With unpaid loans, the bank foreclosed. And who showed up to buy the foreclosed property? The consortium, at a fraction of value. They're engineering it, Sylvie said. Yes, and the county assessor, the marshal, both on their payroll. I've got enough suspicion to fill a barn and not enough proof to fill a thimble. Then we get proof. She said it the way she'd say anything practical. The same voice she used for telling Silas to put on his boots before going outside. Calder looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she said the obvious thing out loud. Like they couldn't decide if she was brave or just hadn't thought it through yet. This isn't your fight, Miss Crane. The debt they threatened to call in? That's attached to my name now, too. Grover made sure of that when I signed the work contract. She held his gaze. So yes, it is. He didn't argue. That surprised her. The next month was the most frightened Sylvie had been since the letter about her father's farm. It was also, and she would admit this only to herself, the most alive she'd felt in years. She started with the other ranching families. There were 7 of them within a half-day's ride who were in some stage of being squeezed by the consortium. She visited on the pretext of borrowing or returning things, a jar of put-up preserves, a borrowed harness piece, and listened. People talked around teachers and preachers and women who'd recently arrived, all for the same reason. They were assumed not to matter. Sylvie took notes on everything. Names, dates, amounts, patterns. The same patterns Calder had seen, repeated across every property. Calder, meanwhile, started writing the fence lines of his land and the neighboring parcels, looking for something he wouldn't tell her about directly. She let him keep that secret for 2 weeks before she asked flat out. And he admitted he'd been looking for evidence that the consortium had rerouted water during the night, physically altered the creek channel to deprive certain parcels while falsely claiming the drought was responsible. Did you find it? Enough to matter if I had someone credible to hand it to. There's a territorial circuit judge coming through Harrow Creek in 6 weeks, Sylvie said. I overheard it at the general store. He's not from around here, which means he's not on anyone's payroll yet. Calder looked at her for a long moment. How do you do that? Do what? Know things. Find things out. I listen, Sylvie said, and I don't look like a threat, so people talk in front of me. Something in his expression shifted. Not much, but enough. He was starting to see her, she realized, not as a household arrangement, not as a replacement for something lost, but as herself, the specific, particular, inconvenient person she actually was. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she went back to her notes. It was Bia who found the ledger. She'd been looking for a place to hide a birthday present for Silas in the back of the storage room, when she pulled a loose board from the floor and found a tin box underneath. She brought it to Sylvie because something about her father's silence on certain subjects had taught her to bring strange things to the new woman first. Inside the tin was a ledger in handwriting Sylvie didn't recognize. Columns of numbers, names, dates, properties, payments. At the bottom of each page, a set of initials, RGH. What does RGH stand for? Bia asked. Sylvie studied the ledger carefully. I don't know yet. She looked at Bia. You did a very smart thing bringing this to me. Don't mention it to anyone else. Bea nodded seriously, the way she did when she understood that something mattered without needing to be told why. Calder confirmed it that evening. RGH was Reuben Grant Holt, the county assessor. The ledger was a record of payments from the consortium to officials who had eased the legal path for their water rights acquisitions. It had probably belonged to Holt's predecessor, a man who died of a heart attack 2 years ago, or what had been called a heart attack. This is enough, Sylvie said. It's almost enough. Calder's voice was careful. If we go to the judge with this alone, the consortium's lawyers will say it's fabricated. We need a living witness. Someone who was in the room. Is there anyone? He was quiet for a moment. There's a man named Webb Darcy. He used to work for the consortium as a property surveyor. Something happened 18 months ago. I don't know what, and he left. Moved to a homestead on the eastern ridge. Won't come to town, won't talk to anyone. Then I'll go to him. Sylvie. It was the first time he'd used her first name. They both noticed it. Neither said anything about it. He might talk to me, she said. I'm nobody to him. I'm not connected to this valley, not in the way you are. He has no reason to be afraid of me specifically. Calder closed his eyes briefly. She'd come to recognize that gesture. It meant he wanted to argue and couldn't find the angle. I'll ride with you, he said. You'll wait at the ridge road, she said. If you come with me, he sees a threat. He needs to see a woman asking questions. He rode with her to the ridge road and waited. Webb Darcy turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his 50s who answered the door with a shotgun and had it down at his side within 30 seconds of looking at her face and deciding she was what she appeared to be. She sat in his kitchen and drank the worst coffee she'd ever tasted and listened to him talk for 2 hours. What had happened 18 months ago was that he'd been present when one of the consortium's managers had explained, very casually to 2 other men, that a rancher named Emmett Cole would have an accident before the end of the month if he didn't agree to the terms being offered. Emmett Cole had died in a barn fire 6 weeks later. I left the next day, Webb said. Told myself they didn't know I'd heard. Maybe they don't, but I've been waiting to find out ever since. Will you testify? Sylvie asked. To who? To a federal circuit judge coming to Harrow Creek in 5 weeks. He looked at his hands for a long time. I've got nothing left to lose, he said finally, and I'm tired of waiting to find out if they're going to come for me anyway. He looked at her. Who are you, exactly? I'm a woman who signed a contract that put her name next to people being squeezed by the same outfit you're scared of, Sylvie said. So I have a personal stake in seeing this resolved. That seemed to satisfy him more than any other answer would have. The danger arrived 11 days before the judge did. It came in the form of Porter Hatch riding up to the ranch at midday with 4 men behind him, which was 4 more than a social call required. Calder was at the barn. Sylvie was on the porch with Silas and Bia. She sent the children inside before the riders reached the yard. Mr. Foss, Hatch said pleasantly, not looking at Sylvie at all. We've become aware that some people in this valley have been gathering information and speaking to certain individuals about consortium business. I want to reassure you that everything we've done is legal and above board, and anyone who claims otherwise is going to have a difficult time in court. Is that a legal opinion or a threat? Calder asked. Just friendly information. Hatch's eyes moved to Sylvie finally, and the pleasantness dropped away enough to show what was underneath. Your arrangement here, Miss Crane, I'd hate to see it become complicated. A woman in your position without family connections in the territory could find herself in a very uncertain situation if this ranch's standing becomes any more precarious. Sylvie looked at him steadily. Mr. Hatch, I appreciate the warning. I'll mention it to the territorial circuit judge when I see him. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happened when someone said something that couldn't be unsaid and everyone in the yard knew it. Hatch smiled. I look forward to meeting him myself. He turned his horse and left. His 4 men followed. That was deliberate, Calder said quietly. Yes, Sylvie said. You just told them we're going to court. I told them we're not afraid to go to court. There's a difference. She watched the riders disappear around the hill. They'll come back, probably sooner than before. Are you afraid? She considered the question honestly. Yes, but I've been afraid of losing things I loved before, and I survived it. This feels similar. Calder looked at her then, really looked, the way he almost never did, direct and unguarded. What did you lose? He asked. My mother when I was 12. My father last spring, in every way that counted, before his heart finally stopped. She kept her voice even. A version of my future I'd planned on. She paused. The things that are left standing are tougher than the things I lost. So am I. He didn't say anything, but he stopped avoiding her eyes after that, which was its own kind of answer. The consortium moved faster than Sylvie expected. 3 days before the circuit judge arrived, she woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. Not the ranch, the Pollard family's place, a mile south, where Hannah Pollard and her husband Orson had been among the 7 ranchers Sylvie had visited. Orange light on the southern horizon visible from her window. By the time she and Calder arrived, the barn was lost. Orson Pollard had burns on his arms from trying to save the horses. Hannah sat in the yard holding her youngest, a girl of 4, while 2 older children clung to her sides. They came in the dark, Orson said, his voice flat. Masked, we never saw their faces. They brought the Pollards back to the ranch. That morning, 2 more families arrived without being asked, having seen the smoke and understood what it meant. By evening, the yard held enough people that the practical logistics of feeding and sheltering them took over, which was probably the only thing keeping anyone from making a decision they couldn't take back. Calder found Sylvie in the kitchen at midnight, sitting at the table with her notes spread out and a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. They'll hit us next, he said. Probably. I could get the families out. Send them east, away from this, they'd still lose their land. Consortium would just do it slower and cleaner while they're gone. At least they'd be safe. You don't know that. Sylvie looked at him. Running just means the fight follows you. I've watched people run from hard things, and I've never once seen the hard thing stop chasing. He sat down across from her. In the lamplight, he looked tired in a way that had been building for 2 years. I keep thinking, he said, about what we're asking these families to risk. They were already at risk. We didn't cause that. No, but we made ourselves the visible part of it. The consortium needed a target, and we handed them one. We were already a target, Sylvie said. I'd rather be a target that's awake. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the low sounds of families settling, a child's murmur, a door closing softly. Why did you really come out here? He asked. Not the contract reason, the real one. Sylvie was quiet for a moment. Because the alternative was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Accepting the fact of losing everything and shrinking into it. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I'd rather be afraid and moving than safe and slowly disappearing. Calder reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a grand gesture, just a steadying one. His palm was rough and warm and more comforting than she wanted to admit. I'm glad you came, he said. It came out like it cost him something. She didn't pull her hand away. 2 nights later, the riders came. 12 of them, which was enough to mean this wasn't intimidation anymore. This was meant to end something. Calder had organized the other ranchers into a watch after the Pollard fire. When the alarm was given, 3 shots fired from the north ridge. There were 12 armed men and women already positioned around the property. Too many witnesses for violence to be quiet. Too many people for a masked raid to look like anything except what it was. The riders came into the yard and stopped when they realized what they were facing. Porter Hatch was in front, and even at distance and in the dark, Sylvie could see the calculation running across his face. She rolled forward on the wagon she'd positioned herself on, not because she was incapable of standing, but because she'd realized that a woman sitting down didn't read as a threat, and she needed him to underestimate her for 30 more seconds. Mr. Hatch, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. I want you to know that everything happening right now is being written down. Names of your men, what you're wearing, the time. In the morning, all of it goes to Deputy Marshal Ingram Crawford, who I wrote to 3 weeks ago, and who arrives day after tomorrow, ahead of the circuit judge. Hatch's stillness was the specific kind that came from surprise badly controlled. You've been busy, he said. I have. I also want you to know that Webb Darcy has already made his statement to the marshal by letter, witnessed and signed. Whatever happens to him or to us in the next 48 hours, the statement is already in Crawford's hands. She paused. You came here to frighten us into silence. We're not silent. We were never going to be silent. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Hatch looked at the armed ranchers, looked at the children's faces visible in the windows, made the calculation that a man like him made when the expected result of a calculation stopped being what he'd planned. We'll see each other in court, he said finally. Yes, Sylvie said. We will. They rode off, and for the second time in her life, Sylvie found herself in a yard in the middle of the night, watching danger retreat, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Calder appeared at her elbow. "That was a bluff," he said quietly. "About Crawford already having the statement." "Partial bluff. I did write to Crawford." She let out a slow breath. "The rest was optimism." He almost laughed. Almost. Crawford arrived the next morning. The circuit judge came the day after. The legal proceedings took 4 days and spilled out of Harrow Creek's small courthouse into the street, with ranchers and their families filling every available inch of space. Webb Darcy testified on the second day, his voice shaking but steady, and the look on Porter Hatch's face when the names came out was something Sylvie would carry with her for a long time. The consortium's property acquisitions were suspended pending investigation. Hatch was taken into federal custody. The county assessor resigned before he could be formally charged and fled east, which was effectively an admission, and the marshal who'd been on the consortium's payroll was removed by Crawford's federal authority before the week was out. It wasn't a clean victory. Clean victories didn't exist on the frontier. The trials would drag on for months. Some of the ranchers would have to fight individually to recover what had been taken. The drought wasn't going anywhere. The land was still dry, and the cattle were still thin, and the work was still harder than it should be. But the water stayed. The Pollards rebuilt their barn with help from every family in the valley. 3 children who'd missed months of schooling started coming to the kitchen table at Calder's ranch, where Sylvie had begun teaching them in the mornings, because the nearest school was 12 miles away, and she was here, and they needed to learn. The 1-year work contract expired on a Thursday in November. Sylvie was in the kitchen when Calder came in from the morning's work. He poured coffee, sat down at the table, and looked at her in the way he'd slowly gotten used to looking at her. Directly, without the deflecting distance he'd maintained in the early months. "The contract's up," he said. "I know. You can leave if you want. The debt's settled. You're not obligated." "I know," she said again. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Bea asked me last night whether you were going to stay. I told her I didn't know." He paused. "I didn't want to make a promise I couldn't keep." Sylvie looked at this man who'd spent 2 years trying to hold a family and a ranch and a private grief, together with nothing but stubbornness and will, who'd built a ramp for her to navigate the back porch more easily without ever mentioning it, who'd learned over 12 months to say what he meant in halves and fragments because whole truths cost him something. "What would you tell her?" Sylvie asked. "If you could keep a promise like that?" Calder looked at her for a long moment. "That you're staying," he said. "If you want to." "I want to," she said. He nodded once, like something important had been settled without ceremony, which, she supposed, was exactly what had happened. Outside, Silas was calling for Bea, and the cattle needed moving before noon, and there was flour to be ordered from the general store, and the horizon line of the Redstone Valley looked the same as it always had. Hard and dry and possible for people stubborn enough to stay. Sylvie refilled Calder's coffee and went to find out what Silas was hollering about. Some days that was enough. Most days she was learning. It was more than enough. It was exactly what staying somewhere felt like when you finally chose it instead of being left with nothing else.